Tonight, we welcome Eric Metaxas to Politics and Prose for his newest book and new New York Times bestseller, If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. Eric has spent his career generating dialogue and conversation. He is the New York Times #1 bestseller author of Bonhoeffer, Miracles, 7 Women, 7 Men, Amazing Grace, and more than 30 children's books. He is the host of his own show, a nationally syndicated radio program heard in more than 120 cities around the U.S. that features in-depth interviews with a diverse roster of guests, many of whom have also spoken here at this bookstore. His newest book, If You Can Keep It, takes a hard, concentrated look at the intertwined, complex state of personal freedom in our country, as well as our ever-changing and ever-evolving relationship to the Constitution. Please help me welcome Eric Metaxas.
Wow, what an intimidating group. Are there other seats for the people standing in the back? Or there's 2 seats here. There's 2 seats here. Oh, you don't like these people? Huh? I know. You're nice, right? Anyway, wow. It's a joy to be here. I was just saying that if I speak to a group of like 1,000, it's far less intimidating than speaking to a small group like this. You're intimidating me right now. You're freaking me out. Cut it out. I just want to say a few things about my book, If You Can Keep It, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I never know where to start with this book. Writing this book was actually very difficult. Writing most books is very difficult, but this one was particularly difficult because if I'm writing a biography, I've written biographies, the narrative is already set. You don't have to think about it. If somebody says, here's the plot, he was born, he lived, he died, and so then you fill in the blanks like a crossword puzzle. It doesn't matter. You just kind of fill it in, and then you're done. Well, when you're writing a book that doesn't have like a narrative arc, now, some of you maybe are writers and you know this better than I do, but it's been torture for me to write essays because when the spine of a piece of writing is an argument, that's really hard for me. I just don't think that way. I don't have like a legal mind or whatever, so it's really hard. And I had so many things I wanted to say in this book, and to kind of figure out how they fit together, I don't know that I did, but at some point you have to hand it in, right? So, now, by the way, is this on? Is this on? Why aren't they laughing? What's the matter? Something's wrong. Okay. So I guess let me just tell you why I wrote this book, If You Can Keep It, and why it's titled If You Can Keep It. Some of you already know, I guess. But the reason I wrote it is because it started maybe 10 years ago. My daughter was 7, and oddly enough, she's only 12 now, and I can explain that later. But no, she just turned 17. But I remember I was reading the Dover book catalog. Some of you are familiar with Dover books. And in there they had a little advertisement, description of a paper model of the house of Paul Revere in the North End of Boston. And it somehow just spoke to me. I thought this would be a nice thing to do with my 7-year-old, to build this paper model of this old house. It just seemed cute. So I ordered it and I started putting it together. And I thought, those of you know when you have kids, it's like a second childhood. You get to, fill in all the blanks, do the things you didn't get to do. And so I picked up a copy of Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. And we all have heard bits and pieces of it, on the 18th of April in 75. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. But as I read it, it dawned on me that I really had never read the whole thing through. And I thought, this is quite a wonderful poem. And the more I read it, the more I thought, this is not just a wonderful poem. This is a genuinely great poem. I'm a writer, as you know, and studied English at Yale. And I thought, as a poem, this is magnificent. He does things in the poem that are really beautiful. Like there are moments in the poem where you feel you are in the place that he's describing. And it shifts. It's quite a long poem. So my daughter and I memorized the poem. And I memorized all the nouns, and she memorized the rest of the poem. And together we were able to, that's not true. But we memorized the poem, and a number of things struck me. First of all, I was very moved. At the end of it, it talks about Paul Revere riding into Lexington and Concord, and it's the middle of the night, and it says, and one there was asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. And it really got me choked up, because this poet, Longfellow, who is so great, is able to evoke someone who at that point was 80-something years dead, but you can see him breathing in his bed, and who that day would be first to fall. And somehow it's the eternal present of art, and you realize that this man is going to die for his country. He's going to be one of the first to die for his country. And I just got choked up. I thought it's so beautiful. And it dawned on me that I really never had any kind of patriotic feeling in that way, really a deep emotional connection, that this man died for liberty. Because I know that I've grown up in an era where to be patriotic, genuinely patriotic, is typically frowned on, especially in places like Manhattan, where I live, or Yale, where I went to. It's just, patriotism is something that really attaches to the past. When we think of patriotism now, we think, oh, it's jingoistic, or it's nationalistic, it's chest-beating tribalism or something. We don't say God bless America. We say, why doesn't God bless the whole world? Why just America? And so I realized that something's missing. And I remembered that my father, my father came from Greece in the mid-'50s. My mom came from Germany in the mid-'50s. Both came on boats to New York City. And when I was growing up, the Greeks aren't shy about being patriotic. And on every year, March 25th of 1820, every year on March 25th, they celebrate March 25th, 1821, which is Greek Independence Day, when they were able to free themselves from the Ottoman Turks, who had enslaved them horribly for 4 centuries. And so every Greek kid growing up, and by the way, if you're raised by a Greek parent and a German parent, as I was, that means you'll be raised Greek. So I was raised, so every year at church or something, they would assign us, we'd have a pageant, we'd have to recite poems or something like that. They celebrate this, and they're so proud of this. And so my father would sit with me on the couch, early in the morning before I had to go to the school bus, and I'd have to memorize one of these incredibly long poems in Greek, And I remember my father, when we were doing that, he would come to a moment in the poem, and he'd get choked up, and he'd turn away, and he couldn't speak. And of course, when you're 12 or something, that's embarrassing. You're not equal to it. But I realized this is now happening with me, with my daughter. It's just 10 years ago. I'm reading this poem, and I'm getting choked up. Because, of course, when you're young and callow and stupid, no offense. If you're young, raise your hand and get out. But when you're young, you are just not able to feel those depths. The older you get, the more you see death and illness and evil and whatever it is. Something happens, your heart is enlarged. And when you read a passage like that, you get choked up. You're not going to get choked up in high school reading about the guy who at the bridge would be first to fall. But it really struck me that this is moving, this is beautiful, and it's just like what my father would experience. Whenever you're touching the eternal, what is true, what is noble, it gets to you. And if it doesn't, it's because you're cynical, because these things ought to get to us. But I feel like I've grown up in an era, last 40 years or so, where we don't really go there. We don't get into that patriotic stuff so much. And I thought that's a real loss. It's a sad thing. I even think that with a poem like Longfellow, with Longfellow's poetry, at Yale I was actively taught to sneer at poems like that. He's no John Ashbery. He rhymes. How childish. And I have to say that I think that's a great pity, because I think that part of what makes a culture and a people is that we have poems and songs and stories in common, right? We don't say, I'm a liberal and you're a conservative. We say, we're Americans, and we all know the story of Paul Revere. We all know the story of Nathan Hale. We all know, these are our stories. And by the way, America is that exceedingly rare country, really unique, where anyone in the world can come here and become as American as George Washington. My parents, who have thick accents to this day, are as American as George Washington. They are legally Americans. They bought into the whole thing. They love their country. That's an extraordinary thing. And I guess I was just really touched by that, and I thought, what is wrong with me and my generation that we don't celebrate this, or that cultural elites who live in this neck of the woods or live in where I live at home, we don't go there. You know, maybe people down south, maybe they need that kind of a crutch of patriotism and God and guns. But I was really touched by this, and I thought there's something really beautiful in this. And I thought of my dad, and here I am with my daughter. And so this poem gripped me and became kind of a passion. And a number of years later, I heard a speech by a friend of mine, Oz Guinness. I dedicate the book to him because I ripped off all his ideas. I don't want him to sue me. And he wrote a book, a tremendous book called A Free People's Suicide, about some of the things that I write about in this book. And at the heart of it is this idea of what he calls the Golden Triangle of Freedom. The Golden Triangle of Freedom, that's his coinage. But the idea, he says, all of the founders understood this dynamic. And it's simply this, that the triangle is that freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith in turn requires freedom. This is the triangle, and I'll explain it. He said that freedom requires virtue, which is to say liberty, self-government, requires people to govern themselves, right? That's not a tautology. Think about it. That self-government means we have to govern ourselves. So if you're going to be governed from without or from above, you know, by globalist overlords in Brussels, for example. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a great audience. If you're going to be governed from without or from above, you don't need to really do anything. You don't need to be virtuous. You just shut up and try not to get shot by the cop who is going to arrest you if you do something wrong. You don't need to be virtuous. You don't need to believe that stealing is wrong. You just need not to steal. But if you were in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, there was a lot of law and order because there was fear. You didn't need to have virtue, right? And so when you have a lot of government, you don't need virtue. But when you have self-government, all the founders understood this can only work, and they wrote about this. They said this over and over and over, and I quote them in the book, that this kind of government, self-government, this kind of liberty that we'd like to try to see if it works, only works with a people of virtue. Now, that's another one of those terms. It's like rhyming poems by Longfellow. We really don't ever talk about virtue. Who talks about virtue or honor or nobility? These are terms that we've become culturally uncomfortable with, which I think is a tragedy. But this idea, when I heard him unpack this, that freedom requires virtue, all the founders understood this, I thought, really? All the founders? Yes. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, all the way down, they all understood that freedom requires virtue, self-government requires virtue. I thought, how is it possible that I went to decent public schools, I went to a good college, I've never heard this, and yet all of the founders wrote about this concept. This is not some conservative idea. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and every one of them understood that the kind of government we're talking about, self-government, liberty, the liberty that we were trying to gain, required virtue. They all wrote about it. I said, it's sort of odd that I've never heard this, and yet it's so central to what they all write. It's there everywhere. And obviously, Tocqueville writes about it 50 years later. Then he says, and virtue requires faith. And of course, that doesn't mean that you need to be a person of faith to be virtuous, or that everybody who's a person of faith is virtuous, but it means that the founders saw, they observed that communities of faith tended to be more virtuous and ability to govern. They had more of an ability to govern themselves. Franklin saw that the preaching of George Whitefield, I devote a chapter to Whitefield in the book, this, the great evangelist was going up and down the 13 colonies for decades, really, preaching and preaching and preaching. And Franklin saw and supported him, was a friend of his and was his publisher, and would print his sermons in his newspapers, although Franklin was himself not a theologically orthodox Christian of any kind. But he saw the value. He said that when people come to faith under Mr. Whitefield's preaching, crime goes down. It happened over and over and over and over. They observed this. This was something they simply observed. Crime goes down, virtue goes up, the ability to govern oneself goes up. You don't steal because you say, I believe stealing is wrong, and I'm not going to steal. So you need less cops, you need less government, whatever. So they all understood that if freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, it all works together. And so they all wrote about it, and it's no big surprise. And I'd never heard this. And then the final leg of the triangle is faith requires freedom. Now, that also I didn't understand. Well, what that means is that real faith, in other words, if faith is forced by a government, you don't need freedom. It's forced, right? But real faith, faith that is going to capture you and that's going to make you want to live it out, it has to be of your own volition. The government can't force you to go to that church or can't force you to believe or not believe. It has to be utterly free. And so obviously religious freedom was the cornerstone of all of this stuff. They said that this cannot work unless the people are freely full of faith and virtue. We cannot legislate virtue. We cannot legislate faith. And the government has to be utterly agnostic on that issue, just like with the free market. The government cannot get involved. It has to step back and allow the people to do it, trusting that it will work itself out. And once the government does sort of establish a religion or get involved in that way, it ruins the whole thing. And obviously they'd seen this in Europe, where if the king is Catholic, nobody else, anybody who's not Catholic, you have to be Catholic or you'll get in trouble. If the king becomes, if the king's a Protestant, then everybody who's Catholic is thrown in dungeons and persecuted. And so they understood that we cannot have that. It has to be utterly free. So that's the golden triangle of freedom. I'd never heard about this before, that self-government, liberty requires virtue, virtue requires faith, faith requires freedom. I'd never heard about this. And Os Guinness explains, well, all the founders understood this dynamic. And again, I said it doesn't make sense. If this is so central that all the founders understood this, not just some little coterie of religious founders, but all the founders, it's at the very center of the American experiment, and I don't know about this. And then there are numbers of other stories besides Paul Revere, a number of other concepts that I hadn't really heard of. Cincinnatus and his plow, that was on the lips of every American up to a certain point. Something happened, I would say, roughly in the 60s. You can trace it to whether it's Vietnam or Watergate, but somehow America came of age, and we really became familiar with the sins of America, which is, I would say, utterly appropriate. That's a healthy thing when you start realizing we treated the Native Americans poorly, to say the least. We treated the African Americans poorly, to say the least. To come to terms with your own sins. But the whole point of coming to terms with them is to repent of them, to work through them, to overcome them, to make policies so that you are free of them, right? It's not to be reminding yourself of them every minute and self-flagellating to the point where you just feel crippled with guilt. That's negative. If you have a son or daughter who has some shortcomings, you want that kid to face the shortcomings and to overcome them. But a parent who just says, bad, 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 you're bad, you'll never amount to anything, you're bad, you're not loving that child. So you're not loving the child if you're continually scolding them for their sins. You're also not loving the child if you don't point out what they've done wrong so that they can overcome it. So a healthy love of country or of anyone requires us to deal with what's wrong, but not to get so mired in it that we cannot ever have any healthy pride, right? Just as you'd want your son or your daughter to have healthy pride. Like, yes, you did these things wrong, but you worked through them and you're doing better now. And that's what love is. It's the difference between love and that kind of judgmental attitude that keeps people in perpetual guilt. And so I realized that this concept of loving one's country had gone out of the culture roughly around the 60s. And so in my experience growing up, there are many things that would have been taught to, if you're 80 years old or 70 years old, you probably would have gotten this in the school. You may have memorized Paul Revere's Ride. You probably know the story of George Washington crossing the Delaware. But a lot of this stuff passed me by. And I remember in 1973, in fifth grade, our teacher, who was an elderly woman, took us up to the flagpole on June 14th to celebrate Flag Day. And she didn't say much about it. She'd been doing this since the 30s when she had started teaching. And we had the trumpet teacher come out, and he played My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the 12 of us stood around the flagpole, and we sang My Country 'Tis of Thee. Then he played taps, which is often played at flag ceremonies. I write all about this in the book. But it was a really beautiful, innocent moment in my life, and I've never forgotten it. It really stuck with me. And I thought, what was going on at that time? And I think, well, it's simple. Without words, we were being taught to love America. But it wasn't chest-beating, tribalistic love. It wasn't anything unhealthy. It was beautiful and sweet. We were being taught to love something that's worthy of love. And I can't think of anything like that experience that happened again in my life. So I thought to myself, there's something missing in the culture. And in the last 40 or 50 years, roughly speaking, again, we've kind of gotten stuck with this negative narrative, and we've over-focused on it in a way that I think is unhealthy. I think that if you don't love your country. There's a Greek proverb that I quote about if you don't boast about your house, it will fall down and crush you. I think there's something about having an unhealthy kind of pride, and I'm not going to mention Trump tonight. I just want you to know that. There's something about having a healthy kind of tribalistic pride, and there's something about having a healthy kind of self-regard and pride. When Jesus said, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, if you're a self-flagellating masochist, then it doesn't really work. You have to have a healthy sense of who you are, right? We're supposed to have a healthy sense of who we are, not overweening pride, but we're not supposed to hate ourselves any more than you'd want your kid to hate himself or herself. You don't want them to be crazy prideful, but you also don't want them to hate themselves. And so love is something that requires a kind of a balance. So I really felt that part of why we are where we are in our culture is because, as I say, roughly since Vietnam, Watergate, we've kind of got caught in this, I was going to say spin cycle, eddy, whirlpool, where we really, we've become uncomfortable with healthy kind of patriotism. I think of movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which deals with political corruption, the horror of political corruption, and yet it's one of the most patriotic films, one of the most beautiful films I think ever made in the history of film, the great Frank Capra. And so all of this made me start talking about these things, and made me think about these things, and eventually I thought, I need to put this to rest by getting it on a page so I don't have to talk about it anymore, although I'm talking about it all the time now because I put it in a book. But I do think it's really important. And then finally, just to end here, before we go to the questions, if you can keep it, that, of course, is Benjamin Franklin famously at the end of the Constitutional Convention was asked by this Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? He shot back, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And sometimes we kind of think that's cute. But it's not cute. It's sort of chilling and haunting, because what he was saying was this republic, which we have rather miraculously crafted into this Constitution, which ought not to have happened. If you know the story, and I tell the story in the book, Franklin, whom we think of as a kind of secular deist, he called the Constitutional Convention to pray. And I have the speech in the book. It's crazy. You thought Franklin called them to pray, to beseech the Almighty to help them because they were not able to do this? It's just crazy. And I never heard that in school. That happened. That's not Christian history. That's American history. Franklin and all the founders understood that putting this together, this fragile experiment, was nearly impossible. And even if they had done it, they had no clue whether it would work. They understood that this was something that had never been done in the history of the world. This self-government is a wild idea. And if the people are able to govern themselves, if they're able to do what I was talking about, this golden triangle of freedom, if that works, it'll be extraordinary. But it is actually up to the people. Self-government is up to the people, which makes perfect sense, right? The government cannot force you to be virtuous. It has to allow the people to govern themselves, and if the people don't govern themselves, the whole thing goes kablooey, game over. Franklin and all the founders understood how fragile it was and that it might well not work. It was indeed an experiment. And so he says this to this woman, this Mrs. Powell, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. If you have a monarchy, you don't need to do any keeping. You just don't commit any crimes, you pay your taxes, and you shut up, and the government will take care of everything. But if you want a republic, you will have to keep it. And I think there's an edge, an unmistakable edge in what Franklin said, witty as he was. He knew that you'd better keep it or it won't keep by itself. And keeping, of course, in the sense of keeping a garden. You have to do your job. Self-government requires far more effort than being governed from without or from above. And so that charge, if you can keep it, it's very real. And it strikes me that we've kept it very well for 200 years, and in the last 40 years, we've pretty much forgotten that we need to keep it. And I think we've given that a pass, and I think because of that, we're in a very, very tough spot. We're in a spot where we've been running on fumes for some time. I think we're at the very edge of the edge. We've ceased to keep it. And if we don't begin to keep it very seriously, immediately, I think we become America in name only. I think we're on the verge of becoming America in name only. We become America in quotes, which looks like America. We didn't have a war. We didn't do anything. We didn't disappear in that sense. We weren't overtaken by foes in that sense. But we sort of were hollowed out from within, and we look like America, but we've ceased to be America. We've ceased to keep the republic. And on that very unhappy note, I will say thank you very much. God bless you. We're very happy to take questions. I prefer true or false questions. Yes, sir.
In your meetings, like the Socrates in the City, do you get questions from, say, skeptics, like, oh, the miracles, the feeding of the multitude, and
we have those people hustled out.
Yeah.
Get them out. I just say, get them out. Get them out.
The one that gets me is a talking snake.
Yeah.
Or do I need to read your book, Miracles?
Well, you need to at least purchase a copy. Well, it's not just at Socrates in the City, but anywhere I am. I think that it's a sign of real health to be willing to deal with tough questions, and not to either say to people, "Shut up, don't ask that question," or to pretend to have some easy answer. I think that. I don't know what you want me to do with the talking snake. You want me to do with the talking snake? Yeah, I think it was puppetry. It was some kind of animation. No, I think that I'm not. It's above my pay grade, as they say, to deal with the details of whether that was a literal thing or wasn't. I think that I don't know. I think there are many times where I would simply say, honestly, I don't know. I have some ideas, but I think that we're not talking about this book now. We're talking about my other books, or about the Bible, or about my faith. But I think that I was just saying this morning. We know enough to say that it works. Just like I know that if I get in the car and I turn the thing and it goes and I can drive to work. If somebody says to me, well, please explain how the carburetor works, I don't know. Do I need to know? It's nice if I know, but there's certain things I don't think that it matters. You can spend the rest of your life kind of figuring it out. But some people kind of pretend like I've got to have every question answered before I can believe in the God of the Bible. I think that that's bad logic. That's intellectually sloppy. You don't do that in any other part of your life. And so there are fundamental questions one has to answer. But the idea that I have to answer every one of them, I don't think that that's realistic, because I think that there's so many people that have struggled with these things. Some of the greatest minds in the world have said, I believe, but they have had questions or they have had disagreements about certain parts of it. So that's my long answer. Would you prefer the short answer? Yeah. So thank you very much.
Hi. So I guess maybe I'm just jaded as a lobbyist.
I'm sorry?
So maybe I'm just jaded from living in D.C., but do you have...
You look really jaded. You've lived a hard life, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, how do you think that we're going to keep it? Or what changes do you think
the Republic?
We can make?
Well, the reason I wrote the book is not just to write a book. And it's kind of funny because some of you are familiar with Peter Hitchens, the brother of Christopher Hitchens. I interviewed him at Socrates in the City in Oxford, England last summer. And he's hilarious because he's really negative. And I said, well, why do you even write? And he says, oh, I want to, it's sort of like I'm writing the obituary of Western civilization, And that's not my attitude at all. I write because I believe that we don't need to be going down this path. It's the same with my Bonhoeffer book, the Bonhoeffer biography. I think that it gives us an opportunity to avoid those errors. It doesn't mean we must avoid them. We're free to not avoid them, or we're free to go down the path of Germany in the sense of, the state destroying religious freedom. And there are all kinds of things, but by writing about them, you give hope that we could overcome them. This book I wrote without a doubt, with a sense of hope, but not so much hope that I'm not realistic. In other words, if you can keep it is a very pointed statement. If you can keep it. Now, by you, of course, it means you and everyone in America. If you choose to keep it, if you choose to do the work of learning about America and living it out and governing ourselves, and what that means, of course, is, first of all, we have to familiarize ourselves with the basics. In other words, when I think of what somebody would have been taught in school 100 years ago or 80 years ago, we need to learn that. That is the minimum requirement to be an American. If you want to be an American in name only, you just want to be, I'm legally American, well, great. But that's really not what the founders had in mind. They had in mind that people would govern themselves, which meant that they would understand the duties involved in self-government, which means knowing your stories, knowing how it works, knowing basic civics lessons and all that stuff. We clearly have a culture today where most people, especially most young people, do not know these things. That is a horror. It is an utter horror. And the reason I say it's a horror is because we've all been given an outrageous gift. If somebody gives you an outrageous gift, a fragile, glorious gift that everyone in the world wants, but they can't have it, you've been given it, and then you go, that's nice, and you put it to the side like a spoiled adolescent. I really think that that's kind of where we are. We have no idea of this glorious, magnificent gift of freedom that we've gotten. We totally take it for granted, or we run it down. That, to me, is really striking because we don't deserve this gift. And it's been given to us, and we have to do this sort of minimum to be stewards of this gift. And I think that self-government, knowing these kinds of things, we really have to get busy. But I do think that if we take it seriously, obviously as a writer, I hope everyone reads this book because I put most of what I think we need in the book. I think if you read this, then you can kind of do the rest. But that's my hope. As an author, what can I do? I can write a book and I can talk about it. That's what I've done. I think that there are a number of stories and extraordinary things in here that they're very inspiring. When you're exposed to them, you just go, wow, I didn't know. I can't believe I didn't know that. That's why I wrote it. But do I believe that we have a chance to keep it? I really think we're at the edge of the cliff. But I firmly believe that if Americans take this seriously, if I could start a conversation on this, that would go beyond this room, I hope, then I do think we could. But by no means is it an easy thing. But when you start realizing what we could lose forever, and the whole world will lose it, not just us, but the whole world, that we have been a beacon of freedom to people around the world in the gulag, looking to hoping that America will take a stand for freedom. My parents, where would they have gone if America didn't exist? I mean, I think about all the people around the world who appreciate what we have infinitely more than we do. They want to come here. Why? Well, because we have something really special, and it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with the fact that it's a gift, and we've been able to maintain it. So that's the answer. I think that I do have hope. I genuinely have hope. But it really is up to every single one of us. And in fact, when people are hopeless, they become part of the problem, because everybody has to have enough hope to say, well, I'm going to do my part, and I'll leave the results in the hands of God and history. But I will do my part. But when people say, it's not worth it, there's something really horrific about that, sad and horrific.
Thank you.
Eric, thank you for coming. My name is Tim McGee, and I just had a question regarding George Whitefield. Do you think we need someone like him today? And if so, what do you think that would look like?
Wow. Well, Whitefield was, I say that he was the kind of evangelist who makes Billy Graham and the Apostle Paul look like loser atheists. He was a wound-up maniac that nobody in history has ever been like him. And ideally, yes, I do think that would be wonderful. But, we can't conjure that up. That's in God's hands. But I do think that we forget. We've certainly forgotten what a dramatic, dispositive effect he had on this nation. There can be no question. And that's another one of the scandals. When I discovered this, I thought, how is it possible that nobody knows the role that he played in paving the way for self-government, in unifying the 13 colonies? They all thought of him as kind of the patron saint of America. Benedict Arnold, before he became the traitor, he made a pilgrimage to the grave in Newburyport, Massachusetts, to tear off a piece of the cloth of the corpse as a relic, because it was sort of, he represented America. This man who preached the gospel of Jesus in such a way that led people to understand, I don't have to bow down before any king. It's between me and God, and I want rulers who are not going to rule over me, but they're going to represent me. And, it's so fascinating. And even if you don't believe in God or the Bible, Whitefield is such an important historical figure that it's kind of astounding that we don't know about him. But, would we benefit from a Whitefield or two? Of course. No question.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I always have to say, I'm not an American. I come from the Caribbean. And I appreciate what you have to say, obviously, about the kind of cynicism. I grew up in the Netherlands. I appreciate the cynicism that is kind of rampant in the West about democracy at this point in time. Not only in the United States of America.
Oh, I know.
Right?
Yeah.
In Europe, I mean, I have so-called the French and the Dutch nationality.
Yeah.
In
Man,
France,
that's dark.
In France, a few explosions and you have Marine Le Pen as president.
Right.
Let's just be honest about
Correct.
it. Right?
Correct.
And then we in the Caribbean need to, at that point in time, say, to hell with this, we're done with this shit.
Yeah.
This one is not going to work
Yeah.
for us. But, okay, it's perfectly fine to make some of the claims you're making, right?
Thank you.
And I think they are important.
Yeah.
But, I come from a part of the world where America has not played a good role.
Right.
In other places of the world. I'm wondering if this cynicism is too much, but this ambivalence that a lot of people have towards the experiment,
Yeah.
right, is not based on the fact that, this is a country that, Obama talks about it, a move towards a more perfect union,
Yeah.
right? Right. The issue is if the move towards the more perfect union is always in the future, right?
Yeah.
For those who are losing now,
Yeah.
it's always hell,
Right.
right? And
So blow it up.
So not blow it up. Then make the more perfect union a perfect union as quick as possible.
Right.
Right. So that the issue that becomes right is how are you going to get there in a much more inclusive way? You were saying that people should talk about America 80 and 90 years ago if they want to talk about. They should learn some of the ideas from
Right.
what was being taught.
Right.
The big problem with that, 80 and 90 years ago, right? Blacks were excluded, women were excluded, et cetera, right? So that the issue is that you face an experiment, right, that has huge problems to it, still presently has huge
Right.
problems to it, right?
Right.
So that on the one side I see, I agree
But
with
you
you.
still live here. You still want to live here.
No, I want to live here.
I guess my point is that.
But the issue that I want to live here doesn't mean therefore there's a First Amendment right to critique of it, right?
No, but I already said that. In other words, to me, criticizing the U.S. and facing our sins is healthy and necessary. It's not even just healthy, it's necessary. So, but this to me is what has made us great, is that we have faced these things and we have a commitment to continue to face these things. But what the problem becomes when we get into a kind of mode of, rather than facing them with a good attitude that we want to work through this and we want to make it better, we get negative and we say it's never going to be better, we still have problems. In other words, it's no different than, as I always say with parents, with kids, that if your kid says, oh, I'm never going to do anything, I'm never going to do it. As a parent, I would say, that's the voice of the devil. Don't tell me you're never gonna. Yes, you will. Yes, you will, and I'll help you. In other words, to have some hope and positive attitude. Otherwise, the other thing, in other words, if we over-focus on our problems, then I would say we're being unrealistic because we have come a long way. And I also think that there's so much good in this country that, if somebody said, where could you live? You live anywhere you want in the world. Where is there a system that's better? So I say to somebody, if you have a better idea, if you tell me how this American experiment can work without God, without virtue, let's say the founders all got it wrong, they had these parochial, old-fashioned views, what's your idea? I don't see there being better ideas. In other words, I would say this is the best idea, and we haven't really worked it, right? In the 12-step program, we say you got to work the program. You got to work the program. And so I think that we've got to work the program. That's the only hope. And I think for 40 or so years we've not been working the program very effectively. So that's my semi-answer. You're very welcome.
My name's Nick Reynolds, and I'm a professional historian. My question is about the American Civil War. Could you comment a little bit about how the kind of ideas you describe in Founding Fathers played a role in 1861?
I wish I could. Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of complicated. Well, I do write about Lincoln in the book, and Lincoln fascinates me because he believed everything I'm saying. He believed like crazy. And I thought, if Lincoln believed these things, why don't we believe them? Now, this is not something that ended in 1798. Lincoln believed these things and wrote about these things. He called this nation the almost chosen people. In other words, he saw that there was more than America in America. The reason the title of my book is The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty is that this is a promise meant for everyone in the world, not just Americans. And that when I think of the Statue of Liberty, which means so much to me, but not just because I live in New York, but because my parents came on boats across and saw this thing. This was not an idea, they said, oh, well, that's a nice idea, but they sure aren't living up to it. They were thrilled that I'm coming to America. I have a chance here. Now, do I think that it was easy for them with thick accents, working as, bus boys and cleaning people's houses? Was it easy for them? No, it was tough. But they said it's okay because this is my best hope that my children can become Americans, and by God's grace, they can go to good schools and they can have a future. That attitude is all over Lincoln. Lincoln sees that the promise of America is for the whole world. And what happened in 1776, he writes about it. I quote him in the book. It was not just for us. And I think that's amazing how firmly he believed that, how firmly he believed in Providence's hand in what we have here. And I think that unless you really know that, you cannot surmount a difficulty such as the Civil War, that you need to have that kind of faith. You need to know what it is you're doing and that you're not fighting for yourself. You're fighting for future generations, for people beyond our shores who long to have what we have. We have been an exporter of freedoms around the world. I mean, we started it here, but we said it's not just for us. We're happy for all of these freedoms to spread around the world. Lincoln clearly got that, and I have to say, startled and thrilled to read how clearly he got these kinds of things. I mean, he would get choked up thinking about the revolution, about the men who died in the revolution and what they were doing. And I thought, we need to tell people that Lincoln thought these things. This is something that, many people thought it beyond Lincoln, but Lincoln is such a figure. So anyway, that's all I'll say on the Civil War. That's a big question, but thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm struck by the way that you've discussed this, and it is very compelling, and how little you've talked about economics and about.
Would you like me to talk about something I don't know? I'd be happy to do that.
No.
I've already told you more than I know tonight.
And very well too.
Thank you.
But it seems to me that it's very appropriate, because I remember when the Berlin Wall came down and there was this idea of sort of the democratization of Germany. There was this sense going around in East Germany that democracy means we're going to get bananas. We're going to have access to all of those consumer goods that we didn't have access to before.
Right.
And if I understand it right, your primary focus is on the idea of democracy or republic as not a mechanism for achieving a certain state, but a mechanism for the continuity of a culture and the continuity of.
What do you mean a certain state? What kind of a state?
A certain level of achievement. Everybody's going to have a certain amount of stuff.
Oh, no. I think that, I touch on it briefly in the book. I talk about, this is where virtue comes in. And this, again, it blew my mind when you kind of realize that there are lots of people, conservative, fiscally conservative people, who believe in the free market like it's the Messiah, right? And like the free market will solve all these kinds of problems. And there are people who believe in democracy and the vote in the same way. And what's fascinating to me is neither of these two good things is worth a hill of beans unless the people are basically virtuous. In other words, the market will deliver whatever the people want. So if the people want, better and cheaper pornography and drugs, the market delivers it. And it's up to what the people want. So if the people are virtuous, the market will do glorious things. But the market and democracy both will only give us what we want. So if we want to elect a dictator like Adolf Hitler who will destroy democracy, we can use the tools of democracy to destroy democracy. If we want to use the free market to destroy the free market, we can do that. And so it struck me that this concept of the golden triangle of freedom, it works everywhere. In other words, without a virtuous people, which is what the founder said over and over and over, the system won't work. And we have not talked about that. When we think about what's going on in Wall Street, right? How do we want to deal with that? With regulations, right? Now, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be regulations, but you cannot solve these problems with tinkering. You cannot solve these problems with technology. At the end of the day, at the heart of these problems is the issue of virtue. If people on Wall Street understood that, no, it's not about the bottom line this quarter, it's about the future of your company for 50 years. Now they have to think in a way that you're encouraged to think more virtuously long term. What are people going to think of us? Martha Rogers, who gave me a wonderful blurb for this book, writes about extreme trust. She has a book. I'm sure it's in this bookstore. It's a big seller. But the idea of extreme trust, right? In other words, that if you want to be really virtuous in a company, you will find customers, they'll never leave you because they know that you you will work for them, that you'll lose money to keep that customer. When you have somebody like that, we've all experienced that in retail, right? You go into a store and say, would you like a piece of bologna for the little kid? Here, Somehow, when there's that kind of generosity and virtue, you make more money. But if you have a short-term, nasty, brutish, myopic view of things, and you say, I want it now, well, ironically, in the end, you'll get less. And so that's part of the dynamic. I don't go into that in depth, obviously, but it's still part of the dynamic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have framed your discussion around the idea that this mindset disappeared.
Can you?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This mind you suggest that this mindset disappeared 40 years ago.
Roughly.
Would you say that this is a fault of the education system?
Yeah.
Okay, so what in particular? The loss of civic lessons?
Yeah.
What else?
Well, I think that's a big part of it. And I think what happened, again, it's like a narrative took hold, right? When you think of the 60s generation, basically it was an anti-establishment, revolutionary kind of generation, which of course is great in many ways. But if you get stuck in a certain mode, that you start saying like, yeah, America's... Go ahead.
We all took civics. I mean, we all gathered some of this in our various civics and governments. And
some people did. I mean, the problem with what I'm saying is that wherever I go, people are different. People say, well, in my school we learned this, in my school we didn't. I'm saying, generally speaking, love of country. Let's put it there. Love of country and pride in the founders and in what George Washington did and all these kinds of things ceased mostly to be taught. It was taught at one time, and it ceased to be taught. I'm speaking in generalities, but I think this is true. And I think that when you stop doing that and when you only put forward this negative narrative, I mean, it goes much farther than that. I've written a number of books, biographies of people that I think as heroes and heroines. I wrote a book called 7 Men and a book called 7 Women. And I think that that's this part of the whole package is the idea that we kind of discovered the anti-hero, and our mantra has been, there are no heroes. Every slugger and sprinter takes steroids, and there's a worm in every apple, and every upstanding guy is, secretly a wife beater. And we've kind of bought into this because suddenly we can discover these things. But I feel like we've gotten trapped in that idea. And when you get trapped in that, when every president is Nixon, you refuse to. You cannot teach your kids, like, now I want you to be like that person. So in my book 7 Men and in my book 7 Women, I put these people forth, and I say we need heroes. If you're not teaching your kids what to be like, if you're saying everybody's kind of, Washington was a slave owner and whatever, you're cheating them of something that's vital.
Where does this narrative come from? I'm sure it comes
the devil.
in churches. No, in churches. It also comes, I know that students get positive messages from their teachers.
Like what?
Oh, are you kidding?
I don't mean, but I don't mean like saccharine, like you're the greatest person ever.
Messages where civic behavior, good civic behavior in a school system is encouraged. People who are kind to the people around them, people who are inclusive, not necessarily patriotic messages or a narrative that is historically based. But children are given these positive messages.
Well, look, to some extent, of course. I mean, we're not living in an utterly nihilistic culture, but I'm saying that we're far more nihilistic.
Where would you propose that these? I don't want to say heroic, but these heroic stories should arise. I suppose they should arise in newspapers. But where else might they arise?
Well, I mean, everywhere. I will say that the cultural elites, the people who, run newspapers and publish books and run, TV and stuff, they have all drunk this Kool-Aid, and I'm one of them, right? Where you really feel like, your job is to find the worm in the apple as opposed to find the beautiful apple. Like if your job is only to find the worm in the apple, you get kind of focused on that. And I just believe that it's kind of everywhere in the culture. Why aren't people making movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? One of the greatest films ever made. Today we would say, oh, it's too corny, or I don't know, it's just too corny. We don't like Jean Arthur. She's too sweet, I mean, I really think that's a lack of cultural health. Now, how it happened is a big, you could write hundreds of books on that. But I think that we need to address it, because unless you're singing the praises of what is praiseworthy, you do a genuine disservice. And I think that we've become very shy about doing that. So I'll leave that at that. Thank you, sir.
Perfect follow-up. We had a group of teachers at the Janney School here who took their kids down to the Lincoln Memorial last year before the start of school so they could actually stand on the steps and articulate their goals for the next year. What do you think is the state of civics education in this country?
Well, that's fantastic, the idea that they brought them down to the Lincoln Memorial. By the way, where'd you leave your clubs? I mean, you were saying, oh, all right. The hat fooled me. But I have to say that, generally speaking, I think the state of civics is terrible. Are there exceptions? I mean, my teacher, Mrs. Saul, that I write about in Flag Day in the book here, she was an older teacher, and she did this beautiful thing which stuck with me. And I wrote it, I sent it, it became an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I got letters from her children and grandchildren thanking me for the, and I thought, this one woman, did she have a clue on June 14th, 1973, that one of the little punks around the flagpole, 45 years in the future, would write about this as a seminal moment in his life? We all have that power. We have that power. Every day, what you do can affect people for decades and will affect the people beyond those decades. And then I think to myself, conversely, what you do negatively can affect people for decades. I mean, we all ought to be horrified, and then we all ought to be deeply inspired, that we need to understand that what one does really matters. And so if you're not teaching kids love your country, because what I say in the book is that, this, I think I stole this from C.S. Lewis, but the idea of if you love something purely, and if your love is real love, it's not tribalistic, we're great and you stink. You all remember Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks did the 2,000-Year-Old Man, right? And he said, yeah, we used to have, we had a national anthem back then. It was, you can all go to hell except Cave 76. That was their national anthem, right? And the point is that we're great, you stink, right? That is not proper love. Love is that when I teach somebody to love the truth, beauty, goodness, in anything, they are loving truth and beauty and goodness in everything. It's the opposite. In other words, if you love America, or if you love your town properly, you are loving the whole world as you do that. You're being taught how to love properly. Your affections are being ordered. That, to me, is really important. I jogged past the Jefferson Memorial yesterday, and I was really moved. And I thought to myself, is anybody building representational statuary anymore? I mean, if you come to New York where I live, I don't know who wrote about it, but, they have these just execrable sculptures is really pushing it. But you think that what we do, what we create, what we say points people that way or that way. And when you look at something that is noble, and you look at Jefferson, I'm not tempted to worship Jefferson, but I see something beautiful in the words that are there. I really do think that, if you think, well, I don't know, I don't believe in anything, we really have to believe in something, or we will believe in something else without articulating it. So anyway, if people are taking their kids to the Lincoln Memorial, I'm thrilled. There's something really great about that. Yes, ma'am. We have time for two more questions.
Okay, second last question is, can you speak to the issue of voting? I just worked in a primary.
Voting? I'm against it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that takes care of that.
No, to speak to the issue of voting?
I just worked in a local primary here, and would say to people, "Are you voting today? Here's a brochure," and people would say, "No, thank you." And it just stunned me because we're at a point where one of the responsibilities of the gift that we have.
Well, see, this is kind of what I'm saying. Like, that's the most basic thing. Like, when people, if you don't vote, you should be ashamed. And this is where you can put cultural pressure, right? Like, we put pressure on people. Like, we look at them if they're smoking. Like, you're smoking, really? We put all this kind of cultural pressure. If somebody doesn't vote, should they be tarred and feathered? Sometimes. But I'm saying that we should look down on them. We should make them feel shame. What is wrong with you? How dare you not vote? If they hear that 5 times, they'll start voting. You have to tell people, listen, You've been given a treasure. You probably don't realize it, but you don't need to realize it. I'm telling you, you've been given an exquisite, fragile treasure. People around the world would literally kill to get that treasure. They want what you have, understand what you have, appreciate what you have, learn what you have, or go someplace else where they don't have it. Let somebody who wants to be here, because this is an outrageous gift. And I'm speaking to myself. Most of my life I haven't appreciated it. Now I begin to realize, like, this is a country worth keeping. This is a republic worth keeping for the sake of those outside this country. This is it's a flame worth keeping lit. So yes, of course, I think this is a minimum. Voting, paying your taxes, not committing a crime, that's the minimum. But first you got to do the minimum, and then, you can get to the other stuff. So thank you. Yes, sir. Final question, no pressure.
Oh, dear me. You sort of breezed over this at the beginning. I'm about 15 years older than you and grew up during Watergate and Vietnam. And it strikes me that those were profoundly disappointing things that made a lot of us very much question.
Oh, absolutely.
Things. And so, is that an obvious statement, or is there? You said, well, it's just this and that. But
you actually didn't hear me speak about that.
No, I did hear you speak
You did
about
hear
it,
me
but
speak
you
about
sort
that.
of breezed over it as saying it may have been this, it may have been that.
Oh, no. The reason I say it may have been because it wasn't exclusively that, or some people say, oh, prayer was taken out of the schools in 1962. That's when there are all of these different things. It's a concatenation of things. So, when you're writing a history book, you only have so many pages to devote. So you mention Watergate and you mention Vietnam, but it's many things. It's many, many, many things. I don't know if I talk about it in the book, or we didn't have room for the chapter, but I talk about how we got here. And a lot of it started among the cultural elites after World War I. I learned this from Peter Hitchens, whom I mentioned earlier. He talks about how devastating World War I, that was the Vietnam of Europe. And far worse than Vietnam. And so people lost faith in the twin authorities of the state and the church, because the state and the church had led them to this horrific pass. But I think that kind of trickled down, when you think of the poems of, Wilfred Owen, the World War I poems that talk about, the old bitch sick in the teeth, referring to Victoria and the British Empire. And they had once had this view of it, which was beautiful, and now suddenly it was despicable. And I think that crept in to the cultural elites in this country. You see it at Yale. I mean, Yale in the 30s, when they were creating a lot of the buildings and stuff, that kind of like highbrow cynicism had already come in. It wasn't there in 1914, but it was there in 1930. So I think it kind of comes in and it works its way through. Buckley, in his book God and Man at Yale, he's writing about the Yale of the late 40s. And he's basically saying that, most of the professors had this kind of like toxic Marxist view or atheist view. And you think, that's very interesting, because it's not like about raccoon coats and vote-o-do. This is about, how America is... in other words, that a lot of that stuff is already starting there, and it kind of percolates. Now, it finds its way into the mainstream in the 60s, roughly, but it's not like, boom, it starts. It's just, it kind of works its way through. It's the trickle-down theory of culture, I would say. And so I do think that you had a question.
Watergate and Vietnam being focal points.
I think, yes. I think ultimately those, if you have to say when did it really take root and solidify, it was then. Something happened, and so we have these brief rave-ups, every now and again, Morning in America, whatever. But the bottom line is that culturally that narrative never changed. Mm-hmm. And I think it's why we are right here where we are at the edge of the abyss. No pressure to all of you, but, if you can keep it, and I do mean this, I want to say this, evangelistically, so to speak, it really is up to you. It's up to my fellow Americans. I can only do what I can do. I really wrote this book because I feel that this is too noble an experiment to let vanish. And so I'm blowing the trumpet from the ramparts and saying, let's do something. This is a glorious thing. And if you read the book, I hope you'll see how glorious it is, and you'll say, yes, this is worth keeping, and what can I do? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.